Sitecore PowerShell extensions. This month we released 6.1 and subsequently 6.1.1 because getting it right is overrated. I'd like to walk through briefly some features and some improvements that were released with it, and hopefully you can try it out and send me some feedback. One of the top features is related to the FindItem command. If you're not familiar with it, it allows you to search the index, typically the Solr search index. And in these two changes, we've added support for faceting. I had a need at work to find duplicate items because we're upgrading from 8.2 to 9, probably 3. And I needed to know items that were at the same path with the same name. And there's a SQL way to approach this, but I thought surely there's a way to search the index, and that would be probably faster than trying to crawl the entire tree or trying to, I don't know, it felt kind of hacky to execute SQL queries. What I did was I added support for the faceting API, and in this particular ticket, if you were to run this example, you would possibly get back more items than you might expect. So let's run that real quick. So here you'll see that there are many items where there's 4 or more, and I think this has to do with the languages. So this item exists in more than one language, and so I wouldn't be too concerned about that at the moment. But if you added more filtering to this, you should end up with certain situations like this item, which I know having trouble highlighting, sample item. I know that there are 2 at the same path with the same name, as you can see here. Just to complete this, the topic of the duplicate names, there's a report, and I think it's under Content Audit, Items with Duplicate Names, and this better implements the query in a way that will find content items and media items with duplicate paths. So one consideration is that probably need to know it in the same language. Not quite sure how much detail I went into this report, but hey, give it a try, and if you see some opportunities for improvements, you see cases where it's just not quite doing the duplicate items query the way you expect, let me know and I can enhance that a little bit more. But in this particular case, I did have 2 media items with the same name, and there's a setting that you would likely see different when you upgrade to 9.x, which relates to the allowing of duplicate names in the same path, and so this installation is on 9.3, so I had to revert the settings so I could do this. And if you're migrating from an older version like 8.2, then this report would be really good to help you identify all those, fix them before you do the content migration, because you may have trouble in bringing content over in your new environment if you're going with that migration approach. There's also another example. So here we have this particular example is what I ran a moment ago, and so I took it a step further, and this is using the dynamic link example where you have a where and where values option, and so this is going to better represent what would have been written in C#, and then these values get injected into this. And this is something that SPE is handling behind the scenes. You just need to know that these are associated with the .NET classes. They're not the field names that would have been in Solr or in Azure or whatever search engine you're using. But some of the other examples that you'll see in the book, those you would end up using the field names that are stored in the search engine. So there's a distinction that needs to be made, but when you follow the examples, you'll pick it up fairly quickly. And so to help support this report, we are finding items that contain this particular set of paths, and so I think one of these is for content and one of these is for media, because that's what we care the most about, and that's something that would be actionable by a content author. And when we expand the results, then we want to get the items to show them in the report, and so media items we make sure that they start with the Sitecore media item path in there. For some reason that's not stored in the search index, at least in my testing. If that's not the case in your installation, let me know and maybe we can improve that. All right, and so jumping back to this 1176, we have the support for filtering. In the search engine, there's some distinction between using the where predicates and filter predicates. My understanding is, at least with Solar, there is a caching that is in effect when you use filter, and my best guess was that if I perform a query, the filtering of the language would be something worth caching, and then you would further reduce the set using the where values. I think there's also something to do with the way that it's scored, and I believe filter does not change the scoring, it just helps reduce the results that you get. So something to experiment with, and if you've got more detail that I could put into the book, just write a brief description and I'd be happy to add it there. And so once again, here we have the where value. So this is a dynamic option, dynamic link option, and then another example using the predicates, so where predicate and filter predicate. I believe in this release this used to be called just predicate, which doesn't really make sense now when I'm added the filter predicate. So this should probably be an alias. So if you have an existing script, it should just work. But if you're writing something new, I'd encourage you to use the new name so that there's less ambiguity between the two. There's also support in FindItem for scope queries. This would be something like you've got a field that has a query builder template with a field for query builder. So SXA makes use of this with the item queries and the scope queries, items that you use for those components that come out of the box. And it didn't really make sense to do all of this just for that, because there's no way for someone to craft that within there. Maybe if you're using the SXA tokens in that query, it would have made sense, but it's not supported in this version. Moving along, the authourable reports package, which allows for you to create reports based on rules, that has been merged together. So you may be familiar with this, and let me just jump and maybe find an example. So here, this authourable reports, and if you look, you may also see a document as rules-based reports. So if you go into the rules, and here we've got rules-based reports. The larger vision was to allow for content authors to create their own reports using rules. It hasn't fully realized into that way yet, because this is all the reports are stored under the modules directory under scripts, and so they really wouldn't have access to that. But if you were authoring the report as a developer, and you want to go and create one, so you could create one of these modules in production. It wouldn't necessarily have to be tracked from source control, so you could do these ad hoc reports, which I do at work. And so then you have this rules section, and so this scope query using the query builder field type would allow for someone to just go, click, find the right pattern they want to use, get their results, and then you can use the rules engine to further filter out that. So this query builder field will only go so far, and it may not be exactly what they want. And so the rules field is a way to go just a little bit further, and maybe your development team creates some custom rules, then you can take advantage of that here. And then if you've not used this before, this piped limited field is for what fields you want to be in the report results. All right, moving on. I did show the duplicate items report. Add rendering learned how to pass through, which means that when you add the rendering, the object that is being added into the rendering, something that you might do with like get rendering, so you get this object back. I think it's called a rendering definition. That item can be passed through, and then you could further manipulate it, or you could further do something with it. So it was useful request, so we went ahead and added it, and took almost no time to do. Made some improvements to the AddItem version when no version exists or the language fallback is enabled. So as I mentioned before, 6.1.1 was released because of the testing in this. I included the configuration file by accident, and thankfully the SXA team had discovered this terrible performance problem, and it turned out to be a really good thing, because one, revealed that this config was included in the package, and so I encourage you not to install 6.1 but rather install 6.1.1 because that's been corrected. And also, for some reason, the fallback settings, they really drag down the item queries that are being performed, and so they were discovering something along the lines of like a 40% reduction in speed. So when you're creating a new SXA tenant, it might take anywhere from 30 to 40 seconds on 6.0, and when you went to 6.1, all of a sudden it was taking around a minute. And so through the research, we discovered, oh well, Michael made a boo-boo and put that config there. But it also turned out to be an opportunity for some coding improvements, and so I'll cover a little bit about those improvements when we go to 6.11. So as I mentioned, the AddItem version supports some additional scenarios, and so if you're using that command, the default behavior remains the same, but if I can recall correctly, what ended up happening was that if you were trying to use AddItem version and there were no versions there, then nothing would happen. And so this just gives you the ability to change that. And I think Alex had added an additional switch. It's probably in the example. And then there's a situation when I was working with Akshay that the fallback, when it's enabled, it also didn't work the way that we had expected, and so an additional condition was added. So if you dropped a patch like this into your solution, then you could then demonstrate or test out the fallback functionality. All right. There was a request to output everything that the ISE outputs. So for example, if you're running write host in your scripts, you would see that spill out in the dialog. And let me just show you that real quick. So if I did something like this, hello would only appear in this screen, but it wouldn't show up in your log files, and you would have to then write out write log with a new log message. And so I think in many cases it would just make sense to just output every single thing that is being written to the screen, and then all of that appear in a log file. So if you have some other tool that's aggregating that, then you can simulate what was happening in the ISE but not actually be staring at the screen the whole time. In order to take advantage of that, there is a new setting, SPE output logging enabled. It's disabled by default because it would just load the log full of stuff that you may not care about. And in this example, I'm just demonstrating the different outputs, the different output streams that PowerShell has. And so now you can see that they are appearing in the log files. So the SPE log typically would have only shown something like this top line here saying that the script is being executed, any log messages that you put there, and then it would finish with a final message saying that it was done, the script was done, and the timing. So now you just get everything spilled out into here. And if you'd like to give it a shot, you just enable the config and then put this example into the ISE and run it. All right, and moving on. There was an issue related to, I think it was path detection with the data importer. And so in some cases, if you're running it and you had the sample CSV contain some spaces at the end or the beginning of the name, it just didn't work quite right. So fix that. And then 1185 has to do with another issue that I think it was some dictionary items that contains a space at the end of the item name, and that creates some issues when you're trying to install through the web deployed packages. I think there was more than one issue with the data importer, so those have been resolved as best as we know. And add rendering also had a situation where some of the values, I believe, set on the standard values was not properly being added, and so we made an improvement to address that. Thank you, Aaron, for your help in testing that. Known issues, there were some known issues in 6.0, and those of course carry over to this release, and you can check out the release notes if you'd like to know more. In 1185, I discovered an issue where when I'm trying to upgrade an existing 9.3 installation with SXA 9.3, that the item that had the space in it, it doesn't properly install the package. And if I understand correctly, it has to do with something that's running in SXA. So if you are upgrading an SXA solution and you encounter an item moving exception, a command for you to run, this one right here, which will go delete the item in the core database, and then you just run the installation like normal. That issue may be addressed in a newer version of SXA, so it could be just very specific to that, but let me know if you encounter it so I can keep some tabs on how often people are running across that problem. All right, moving on to 6.1.1. There was some crazy performance improvement that AddItem was able to accomplish. Probably should have created a issue for that, but at the end of the day, what does that mean for you? Well, there were some performance problems with import function, and I believe there's a threshold at how many items were being stored in the cache for that function, for that command. And so if you ran it frequently, you may not actually get all the items in there that you would have expected to begin with, because the query was capped at 150 or 250 or whatever that may have been. And so the caching was changed in such a way that that limit doesn't exist. With 6.1, if you were running the unit test for SXA, which is bundled with SXA, by the way, if you ran a unit test for creating a new site with all the default settings, the 6.1, with the configurations the way one would expect, it was taking about 108 seconds. With the import function improvement, it took it down to just under a minute. And then I also had some testing results to show you the impact of having the language fallback config there versus not. So we expect 6.0 and 6.1 to approximately be the same, which it is the case. And with that config there, it added quite a bit of time. So with the config removed, with the performance improvement on the same instance, that test seemed to have dropped down below 10 seconds, which seems ridiculous for what users are experiencing. So I think in general operation of SXA, you wouldn't really notice much about it because you're not creating tenants all the time. But 7 seconds from 33 seconds, that's still quite a drop. And going from 108 to 53, that's still pretty good. You probably create more sites than you'd be creating tenants anyways. So this improvement would certainly be more noticeable. All right, well, I think that's about it for today. If you've got any questions or comments, leave it in the comments down below. And if I've got any more details to share, I'll probably put it in the description in the video. All right, cheers.